It started with a single white carnation. I worked the early shift at Holloway Architecture, which meant I arrived before the sun bothered to show up and before anyone else in the office had finished their first cup of coffee. My job was unglamorous. I filed permits, organized blueprints, made sure the senior partners didn't lose their reading glasses for the fourth time in a week. I was 26 years old, and I had been quietly, hopelessly in love with Edward Prince since the day he walked into the building wearing a charcoal coat and an expression that suggested the entire world owed him an explanation. He never noticed me. Not really. He said good morning the way you'd say it to a chair, a polite acknowledgement of an object that happened to be in his path. He was the firm's golden architect, the one whose name got whispered with a kind of reverence, the one who could redesign a skyline in his sleep and somehow make it look like he was bored doing it. I was nobody to him. A name on a name tag, a blur in his periphery. So I started leaving him flowers. It wasn't a plan, not really. I passed a flower stall on my way to work one gray Thursday, and on a whim, I bought a single white carnation and set it on the corner of his desk before he arrived. I didn't sign anything. I didn't leave a note. I just wanted, selfishly, for some small part of me to exist in his space, even if he never knew it was me. He never mentioned it. I watched him from my desk that morning, peering over my monitor like some kind of amateur spy, and I saw him notice the flower, pick it up, turn it over in his fingers, and set it down again without any visible reaction. I told myself that was fine. I told myself I didn't need a reaction. I just needed it to be there. The next week, I brought another one. And then another, the week after that. Carnations, at first, because they were cheap and durable and didn't scream main character. Then I got a little braver. Daisies. A sprig of lavender once when I was feeling sentimental. By the third month, it had become a ritual I didn't examine too closely. A small offering I made before the office filled with the noise of phone calls and printer jams and Edward Prince's low, clipped voice directing junior architects like a general arranging troops. I told myself it meant nothing. I told myself it was harmless, the kind of secret you keep from yourself as much as from anyone else. But the truth, if I'm being honest now, looking back on all of it, is that the ritual became the architecture of my entire week. Monday through Wednesday were ordinary, forgettable days, filing and phone calls and the low hum of an office grinding through its routines. Thursday was the day I started thinking about flowers. I'd pass the same stall on my way home, run by an elderly woman named Greta, who eventually, without my ever explaining anything, started setting aside whatever bloom she thought suited the week. She never asked who they were for. I think she understood, in the quiet way that flower stall owners seem to understand everything about the people who buy from them regularly, that the asking wasn't the point. Something patient today, she told me once, handing me a small bundle of dried lavender, for someone who doesn't know they're waiting for something yet. I didn't know at the time how right she was. Friday nights, I'd lay out whatever I'd chosen on my kitchen counter and consider it for far longer than was reasonable, turning it under the light, deciding whether it suited the week Edward Prince had been having. I paid closer attention to him than I ever let myself fully acknowledge. I noticed when he came in looking exhausted, his tie slightly crooked, evidence of a late night spent fighting with a client over budget concerns. I noticed when he seemed lighter, when a project had gone well, when he allowed himself the rare luxury of laughing at something one of the senior partners said in a meeting. I built an entire private language out of his moods, and I answered it, every week, with a flower I chose specifically because of what I'd noticed. It became, without my ever admitting it to myself in so many words, an act of devotion disguised as a harmless habit. I told myself I was simply being kind. I told myself anyone would do the same, given the chance, given a desk that happened to belong to someone they found quietly, hopelessly compelling. But nobody else left him anything. I checked more than once, lingering near his desk under some flimsy pretense, just to be certain no one else had beaten me to it, which tells you everything you need to know about how far gone I already was, long before I had any evidence he'd noticed at all. There was a particular Tuesday in late winter, almost 8 months into the ritual, when I nearly stopped altogether. I'd had a difficult week of my own, nothing dramatic, just the slow, grinding exhaustion of being invisible in a building full of people who barely registered my existence beyond my usefulness. And I remember standing in front of Greta's stall, staring at the buckets of flowers, feeling suddenly overwhelmingly foolish. What was I doing? Leaving anonymous gifts for a man who called me by my first name twice a year, who probably couldn't have picked my voice out of a lineup of every other employee in the building. It felt, in that moment, less like devotion and more like a kind of slow, voluntary erasure, the way I kept making myself smaller and smaller in service of a feeling he didn't even know existed. "You look like you're about to give something up," Greta observed, not unkindly, as she wrapped a small bundle of white carnations. My old standby. The one I returned to whenever I didn't trust myself to choose something more daring. "Maybe I should," I admitted. "It's a little pathetic, isn't it? Leaving flowers for someone who has no idea who I am." She considered this for a long moment, tying off the bundle with the same careful attention she gave every arrangement, regardless of how small or inexpensive. "I've been selling flowers on this corner for 30 years, she said. "You'd be amazed how many people walk past here every single day, carrying entire histories nobody else can see. The flowers aren't pathetic. The flowers are just patient. There's a difference, even if it doesn't always feel like one." I bought the carnations that day, the same as always, and left them on his desk the next morning. The same as always, though I remember standing there a few seconds longer than usual, watching the door for any sign of him arriving early, some small, reckless part of me, almost hoping to be caught just so the waiting could finally end one way or another. He didn't come in early that day. I went back to my desk, and the ritual continued the way it always did, and I told myself, not for the last time, that this was enough, that loving someone quietly without expectation was its own kind of complete experience, even if it never became anything more. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, sitting at my desk that gray Tuesday morning convinced I was invisible, was that Edward Prince had, in fact, come in early that particular week. Not that day specifically, but close enough to it that the timeline, when he finally told me the full truth months later, made my stomach drop with a strange vertiginous mixture of relief and horror. There was a week in February, he told me much later, after the office had emptied out and the flowers had stopped being a secret, when I nearly came in early enough to catch you. I stood outside the building for almost 10 minutes, working up the nerve to walk in before you'd had the chance to leave and disappear again. I lost my courage. I told myself it was for the best, that confronting you directly would only frighten you off, that whatever this was functioned better as long as it stayed exactly as anonymous as you'd designed it to be. "You almost caught me," I managed, stunned. "That whole time, I thought I was completely unseen." "You were never unseen." His voice had gone quiet. "I simply lacked the courage to let you know that." It's strange looking back on that entire year now to realize how much of it had been a quiet, parallel devotion, me leaving flowers convinced I was speaking into a void. Him watching the recordings convinced he had no right to interrupt something so carefully, deliberately anonymous. We'd built an entire relationship out of mutual restraint, each of us terrified of disrupting something neither of us fully understood we were already participating in together. There was a particular flower I chose, near the end of that year, that I think captures the whole strange architecture of what we were building without either of us realizing it. It was late autumn, the kind of gray, wet week that makes everything feel a little hopeless, and I'd found at Greta's stall a small bundle of chrysanthemums, deep amber and rust-colored. The kind of flower that doesn't announce itself the way roses do, but carries its own quiet persistence regardless. "Endurance," Greta told me, when I asked what they meant, half joking, the way I sometimes did by then, having absorbed enough of her quiet flower stall wisdom to start believing some of it. "They mean endurance, something that survives the cold without needing to be told it's worth keeping alive." I left them on his desk that Wednesday, and I remember walking away from it with an unusual, settled certainty. Not that anything would change, not that he would ever say anything, but that the act itself, regardless of outcome, had become something I needed for my own sake as much as for his. I wasn't leaving flowers anymore, purely out of longing. I was leaving them because the act of choosing kindness, week after week, without guarantee of return, had become its own quiet education in patience. I was learning, slowly, how to love someone without needing it returned immediately, without needing proof, without needing anything beyond the simple, private satisfaction of having shown up. I didn't know, of course, that those particular chrysanthemums would end up months later, occupying a careful place near the top of Edward's private ranking system. Tucked into his wooden box of pressed flowers with a reverence I never could have predicted. I didn't know that he'd had an unusually difficult week that same autumn, a project collapse, a contractor dispute, the kind of professional disappointment that for a man who measured his entire worth in precision and competence, had cut deeper than he ever let on at the office. I didn't know that the small bundle of amber chrysanthemums had arrived on his desk during the exact week he needed more than almost any other to be reminded that someone, somewhere, was paying enough attention to notice without ever once asking for anything back. We didn't know any of this about each other, not really, not in any way that mattered, until that Friday evening when the security footage finally bridged the distance. Neither of us had been brave enough to close on our own. What I did not know, what I would not find out until almost a year later, was that Edward Prince had reviewed the security footage from the very first morning. The first flower appeared on his desk. He knew exactly who I was. He had known for 361 days. I found this out on a Friday evening when the office had mostly emptied out, when the overhead lights had that buzzing, half-asleep quality they get after 6 p.m. And I was finishing up a filing project that should have taken an hour and had somehow eaten my entire afternoon. I assumed I was alone. I had my earbuds in, half listening to some podcast about urban planning that I wasn't really absorbing, and I didn't hear him approach until his shadow fell across my desk. Alan. I nearly knocked over my coffee. He never used my first name. In the 2 years I'd worked there, Edward Prince had called me by my first name maybe twice, and both times had been preceded by some kind of minor office catastrophe. I pulled my earbuds out, scrambling for some kind of professional composure. "Mr. Prince, sorry, did you need something?" He had a folder in his hand. Not unusual. He was always carrying folders, blueprints, something. But there was something different in the way he held this one, something deliberate. He set it down on my desk without a word, and stood there, watching me with an expression I couldn't read. Edward Prince had a face built for unreadability. Sharp angles, a jaw that looked like it had been drawn with a ruler, eyes the color of wet slate that gave away exactly nothing unless he wanted them to. I looked down at the folder. Then I looked up at him, confused. "Is this for the Hendrix project?" "Open it." Something in his tone made my stomach drop, though I couldn't have told you why. I opened the folder. Inside were photographs, printed stills, the kind you'd pull from a security camera feed, slightly grainy, time-stamped in the corner. The first one showed me standing at his desk at 6:42 in the morning, nearly a year ago, setting down a single white carnation. My hair had been shorter then. I remembered that morning distinctly. The cold had made my fingers clumsy, and I'd nearly dropped the flower trying to position it just right. There were more. Dozens more. Each one time-stamped. Each one showing me at his desk in the gray hush of early morning, leaving something small and unremarkable behind. A daisy. A sprig of eucalyptus. A single yellow tulip on what I now realized, with creeping horror, had been his birthday. I didn't say anything. I don't think I was capable of saying anything. My ears were ringing the way they do right before you faint, though I managed not to faint, mostly out of sheer stubbornness. "You've known," I finally managed, my voice coming out smaller than I wanted it to. "This whole time. You've known it was me." I reviewed the footage the first week. His tone was even, almost clinical, the same tone he used when discussing load-bearing walls or zoning regulations. Security flagged an unidentified individual accessing my desk before office hours. Standard protocol. I watched the recording to confirm there was no security risk. "And you just kept watching for a year?" Something flickered across his face then, something I couldn't immediately place. If I hadn't known better, if I hadn't spent 2 years convincing myself that Edward Prince was constitutionally incapable of anything resembling vulnerability, I might have called it embarrassment. I kept the footage, he corrected. I didn't watch it obsessively, if that's the picture forming in your head. I checked, occasionally, to see if it would continue. Why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you? The question landed harder than I expected. I opened my mouth to answer and found I didn't have one, not a good one, not one that didn't sound pathetic out loud. The truth was simple and humiliating. I hadn't said anything because saying something would have required admitting that I loved a man who barely registered my existence, and admitting that out loud felt like handing someone a knife and asking them to use it gently. I didn't think you'd want to know. The words came out smaller than I intended. I didn't think you'd care either way. I gestured vaguely, encompassing the whole impossible fact of him. You're Edward Prince. I'm the guy who reorders your blueprint folders. You're the guy who left flowers on my desk every week for a year, he countered, without ever once asking for anything in return. Do you understand how rare that is? I didn't know what to say to that. I stood there holding a folder full of evidence of my own quiet devotion, feeling like I'd been caught at something far more intimate than I'd intended. And Edward Prince watched me with those slate-gray eyes that had apparently been watching me in some fashion for the better part of a year. I'm not. I started and then stopped, because I genuinely didn't know how to finish that sentence. I'm not trying to make this weird. I'm not trying to embarrass myself further. I'm not in love with you, which would have been an outright lie, and I think we both would have known it. You're not what? He asked, and there was something almost gentle in the way he said it, a softness I had genuinely never heard from him before. Not in 2 years of overhearing him on conference calls and watching him eviscerate underprepared contractors in meetings. I don't know, I admitted. I don't know what I was going to say. He was quiet for a moment. Then he did something that knocked the breath clean out of my chest. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small folded square of paper. Worn soft at the creases, like it had been handled many times. He set it on the desk next to the folder. Open that too. My hands were not steady when I unfolded it. It was a printed photograph, smaller than the others, clearly cropped from a larger frame. It showed me from an angle that must have come from the lobby camera, caught on some random Tuesday. Not the desk, not the flowers, just me. Laughing at something, my head tipped back, mid-conversation with one of the receptionists. It was an unremarkable photo. I looked unremarkable in it, ordinary, caught off guard. This is the one I actually kept on me, not the desk footage. This one. Why? His voice had dropped into something lower, something careful, like he was choosing each word with the precision he usually reserved for structural calculations. Because the flowers told me you were thoughtful. This told me you were happy, actually happy, not performing it for an audience. I wanted to remember what that looked like. I felt something crack open in my chest, slow and unbearable, like ice giving way on a lake. Edward. He cut me off, though not unkindly. I should have said something months ago. I told myself I was respecting your privacy, that if you wanted me to know, you would have signed something, left a note, done anything other than vanish before I arrived each morning. But the truth is, I was a coward. I didn't know what I would do with the answer if I asked, and not knowing felt safer than finding out I was wrong. Wrong about what? About whether you meant it the way I hoped you did. The office around us had gone fully silent, the kind of silence that exists nowhere except empty buildings after hours, when even the air conditioning seems to hold its breath. I was aware of my own heartbeat in a way I rarely was, a frantic, stupid rhythm that felt like it might be visible through my shirt. Once I started, the words came faster than I could control them, tumbling out in a rush I hadn't planned and couldn't stop. I meant it. I've meant it since the first one. I used to stand by the coffee machine and watch you pick them up just to see what you'd do with them. You never threw them away. Did you know that? You always set them somewhere they wouldn't get crushed under paperwork. I used to tell myself that meant something, and then I'd tell myself I was being ridiculous, reading meaning into a man just being tidy. It wasn't tidiness. I know that now. I kept everyone. Pressed, most of them. There's a box in my apartment that I've never shown anyone, because showing someone would have meant explaining it, and I didn't have an explanation that didn't sound like. He stopped himself, jaw tightening slightly, and for the first time since I'd known him, Edward Prince looked uncertain, like I'd built an entire emotional architecture around a stranger's kindness. I wasn't a stranger to you. You knew exactly who I was. I knew your name and your shift schedule. I didn't know you laughed like that. I didn't know you hummed when you filed things, off-key, completely unaware you were doing it. I didn't know any of the things I've spent the last year learning by watching you exist around me because I was too much of a coward to simply ask you to coffee like a normal person. I laughed, a startled, watery sound, half disbelief and half something that felt dangerously close to joy. You're Edward Prince, you're not supposed to be a coward about anything. The corner of his mouth did something I had genuinely never seen it do. It curved, just slightly, into something that might generously be called a smile. Apparently, I reserve all my courage for buildings. People terrify me considerably more. I terrify you? You've terrified me for 2 years, long before the flowers. I used to find excuses to walk past your desk. I told myself it was efficiency, that your desk happened to be on the most direct route to the printer. It wasn't. There's a faster route. I checked more than once in case I was lying to myself. You checked the floor plan to see if you were lying to yourself about walking past my desk. There was a particular dryness in his voice that I now understood, with sudden and overwhelming clarity, was simply how Edward Prince flirted. I am an architect. I measure things. It's how I make sense of feelings I don't have a better vocabulary for. Something about that, the absurdity of it, the unexpected tenderness buried inside his clinical phrasing, undid me completely. I felt my eyes sting, which was humiliating standing in an empty office at 6 in the evening, but I let it happen anyway. Because pretending otherwise in front of him suddenly felt like a worse kind of foolishness than crying. I don't know what we do now, I admitted. I've spent a year building this whole ritual, I guess, around never being seen. I don't actually know how to do this part, the part where you look back. We could start simply. I could take you to dinner, somewhere that isn't this building, somewhere I haven't already memorized every angle of. You've memorized the angles of this building? I designed half the renovations on this floor. I could draw you the load-bearing walls from memory. It's not romantic, I'm aware. It's a little romantic, I admitted, and meant it. He studied me for a long moment, that careful, considering look he usually reserved for blueprints, like he was trying to determine if something would hold weight before he committed to building on top of it. Then he reached out, slowly, like he expected me to step back, like some part of him still wasn't entirely convinced this was real, and brushed his knuckles just barely, against the back of my hand where it rested on the desk. It was such a small touch, barely anything at all, and it still felt like the floor had tilted 30 degrees beneath me. Dinner. Yes. I'd like that. I'd like that a lot, actually. Tonight, I have eucalyptus filing to finish. All in. I'm joking. Yes, tonight is fine. Tonight is good. He nodded, and something in his shoulders loosened, some tension I hadn't even registered as tension until it was gone. He picked the folder back up, the one full of grainy security stills documenting a year of quiet devotion, and held it against his chest for a moment like it was something fragile. I'm keeping this, if that's all right, not the desk footage. I'll have that deleted. It's a security liability regardless. This one. He held up the small folded photograph again, the one from the lobby camera, the one that had nothing to do with flowers at all, and everything to do with the unremarkable. Ordinary fact of me laughing on a Tuesday afternoon. You can keep it. I'd actually prefer that over you having a year of security footage of me on file somewhere. He repeated it firmly, like he wanted to make sure I believed him. It's deleted. I made certain of that this afternoon before I came to find you. I didn't want this conversation to feel like I had leverage. I wanted it to feel like what? Like what? Like a beginning, he finished, and not an accusation. I thought about that for a long moment, standing there in the half-dark of an empty office, the overhead lights buzzing faintly above us. My whole carefully constructed secret laid bare on the desk between us in a stack of printed photographs. It does. Feel like a beginning, I mean. That night, he took me to a small restaurant a few blocks from the office, one I'd never noticed despite walking past it 100 times, tucked between a dry cleaner and a shuttered bookstore. He ordered wine and didn't ask me what I wanted, then immediately apologized for it, explaining, somewhat sheepishly, that he'd spent so long imagining this exact dinner that he'd apparently rehearsed the wrong half of the conversation. You rehearsed this? I asked, delighted despite myself. Extensively, he admitted. Badly, evidently. What else did you rehearse? An entire speech, he admitted, about flowers and architecture and metaphors involving foundations, which sounded significantly less ridiculous in my head than it does now that I'm attempting to say it out loud to you. Say it anyway. He looked at me across the small candlelit table, and for a moment the careful, controlled mask he wore at the office fell away entirely, leaving something younger and more uncertain underneath it. Something that made my chest ache in the best possible way. He spoke slowly, working through it as he went. I used to think a building only mattered if it was permanent. If it could withstand everything, weather, time, neglect. I built my whole career around that idea. Strength as the only virtue worth designing for. And then you started leaving flowers on my desk, something so deliberately temporary, something that would wilt within a week no matter what I did, and I couldn't stop thinking about why that mattered to me so much. Why I kept pressing them instead of letting them fall apart the way they were supposed to. Why do you think it mattered? Because permanence isn't the only thing worth building. Sometimes the thing worth building is just showing up, again and again, even knowing it won't last forever in the form it started in. You showed up every week for a year without ever asking me to notice. That's not nothing, Alan. That's its own kind of foundation. I didn't trust my voice not to crack. So I reached across the table instead and took his hand, and he let me his fingers curling around mine with a kind of careful certainty, like he'd been waiting a very long time to be allowed to do exactly this. I'll keep showing up, if you want me to, not anonymously this time. I'd like to know it's you. I'd like to actually see you do it. I missed that, this whole year, watching from a screen instead of being in the room. You could come in early, I offered, catch me in the act. That almost smile appeared again, the one that was becoming rapidly, dangerously addictive. I think I'd rather you just hand them to me, in person, no security footage required. We sat there for a long time after the food arrived, talking about things that had nothing to do with flowers or footage or any of the careful evasions we'd both maintained for 2 years. Talking about his mother's old house in the countryside. About the building he'd always wanted to design, but never had the right client for, about my own small, unremarkable dreams that I'd never told anyone at the office because nobody had ever asked. He listened the way he apparently did everything else, with complete and undivided attention, like I was a structure he was determined to understand from the foundation up. By the time we left the restaurant, the night had turned cool. That particular autumn chill that makes you want to walk close to someone for warmth. And I found myself doing exactly that, my shoulder brushing his as we walked back toward the parking garage. Neither of us seemed to be in any hurry to reach. Can I ask you something before we get back? Anything. Why a carnation? I mean, why did it work, that first one? You could have ignored it, thrown it away. Most people would have. He considered the question seriously, the way he considered everything, like the answer mattered enough to get exactly right. I think it was the first time in years anyone had given me something without wanting something back. Everyone in that office wants something from me. A promotion, a recommendation, a piece of credit on a project. You wanted nothing. You didn't even want to be known. That kind of generosity is rare enough that I couldn't bring myself to throw it away even before I understood what it meant. And now you know what it meant. He stopped walking, turning to face me fully under the orange wash of a street lamp, his expression open in a way I still wasn't fully used to. Now I know exactly what it meant. It meant you saw something in me worth being patient for. I'd like the chance to be worth that patience, properly, now that I know. You already are, you have been the whole time. I just never thought you'd notice. I noticed everything. His voice had gone quiet. I just didn't know how to say so without frightening you off. You could have just said hello. I did say hello. Every single morning. You said it like I was a chair, he laughed. Actually laughed. A real, surprised sound that transformed his whole face, and it was, without question, the best thing I had ever heard. I'll work on that. Saying hello like you're not a chair. I'd appreciate that. He reached up, then slowly giving me every opportunity to step back if I wanted to, and brushed a strand of hair away from my face with a gentleness that didn't match anything I'd previously associated with Edward Prince, the cool, exacting architect who terrified junior staff and redrew skylines without breaking a sweat. This version of him, standing under a street lamp with his hand barely touching my face, looked like someone discovering an entirely new kind of structural integrity, one that had nothing to do with steel or concrete. "Can I kiss you?" he asked. "Or is that moving too quickly, given that I apparently spent a year stalking you via security footage before working up the nerve to say anything?" "You weren't stalking me, you were waiting." "There's a difference." "Is there?" "I left flowers on your desk for a year without ever introducing myself," I pointed out. "I think we're both equally guilty of taking the long way around." "So that's a yes." Keen to guess it. "That's a yes," I confirmed, and he kissed me there on the sidewalk outside a restaurant. Neither of us would ever forget, careful and unhurried. Like he was finally allowed to build something he'd been sketching in private for longer than I'd known. We went back to the office the next Monday, like nothing had changed, except everything had. I still arrived early. I still walked past his desk in the gray hush before the rest of the building woke up. But this time, instead of leaving something and slipping away unseen, I found him already there, waiting, a second cup of coffee set carefully beside his own, like he'd learned somewhere in the space of a weekend. Exactly how I took mine. "You're early. I wanted to see you do it, in person, this time." I had a single white carnation in my bag, an old habit I hadn't quite been able to break, and I set it on his desk the way I had 361 times before. Except this time, he was watching openly, without pretending to be absorbed in something else. "There. Now you've seen it." Something in his voice, low and warm, made the whole cold, fluorescent-lit office feel briefly, impossibly soft. "I have. I think I'd like to see it every day, if you're willing." "I think I'd like that too." He reached for my hand under the desk, where no one walking past could see, and held it like something he'd finally been given permission to keep. Outside, the city was waking up the way it always did. Car horns, distant construction, the ordinary noise of 1,000 ordinary mornings. But inside that office, in the quiet space between two people who had spent 2 years circling each other without ever quite landing, something had finally, irreversibly begun. It hadn't been the flowers. In the end, not really. It had been the year of showing up, of choosing him quietly, again and again, without ever once asking for anything back. And it had been his patience, his careful watching, his year of pressing every wilted bloom into the pages of some private, unspoken book, waiting for the courage to finally turn around and say, "I see you too." I kept bringing him flowers after that, not anonymously, not secretly, not slipped onto his desk before the sun came up. I brought them openly, handed them to him with my own hands, watched his face do that small, private thing it did whenever I caught him off guard with tenderness. Some habits, it turned out, weren't meant to be broken. They were only ever meant to be witnessed. And every single time, without fail, Edward Prince set the flower down somewhere. It wouldn't get crushed under paperwork, the same as he always had, the same as he always would. Not because it was tidy, and never because he had to, but because, after everything, he had finally learned exactly what it meant, and he had no intention, not for one single morning, of letting it go to waste. The weeks that followed felt like learning a new language I'd somehow already been speaking for 2 years without realizing it. Office life didn't change, not on the surface. I still filed permits. He still terrified junior architects in meetings, still redrew skylines with the bored precision of a man rearranging furniture. But underneath all of it, something steady had taken root, and it changed the texture of every ordinary moment we shared. He started finding reasons to walk past my desk that he no longer bothered disguising as efficiency. He'd stop, lean against the edge of it, ask some half-relevant question about a filing system he understood perfectly well, just to stand near me for 90 seconds before someone called him away. I started noticing things about him I'd never let myself notice before, back when noticing felt dangerous. The way he tapped his pen against his lip when he was thinking through a structural problem. The way his voice dropped half an octave when he was genuinely pleased with something instead of merely satisfied. We kept it quiet at first, not out of shame, but because something this new and this fragile felt like it deserved privacy before it became office gossip. We told no one. We were careful in the hallways, careful in meetings, careful in every shared elevator ride, though I caught him more than once failing spectacularly at careful. His eyes finding mine across a crowded conference room with an intensity that probably wasn't doing either of us any favors in terms of secrecy. "You're terrible at this," I told him one evening, the two of us alone in the break room, the rest of the floor emptied out for the night. "At what?" Being subtle. "You looked at me for an entire client presentation like you'd forgotten there were other people in the room." "There were other people in the room," he replied, entirely unbothered. "I simply found you more interesting than the zoning variance we were discussing." That's a low bar. Everyone finds zoning variances boring. Not everyone looks like you while discussing them. I threw a napkin at him. He caught it without even glancing over, which felt deeply unfair, the kind of effortless competence that should not have been as attractive as I found it. 3 weeks into whatever we were now calling this, neither of us had used the word relationship yet, though it sat between us unspoken. Every time our hands found each other under a desk or across a restaurant table, he invited me to his apartment for the first time. I'd expected something cold and architectural, all sharp angles and minimalist furniture, the kind of space that photographed beautifully and felt like nobody actually lived there. Instead, I found warmth. Bookshelves crowded with paperbacks that had clearly been read more than once, their spines cracked and soft. A worn armchair by the window that didn't match anything else in the room, clearly kept for sentimental reasons rather than design cohesion. And on a shelf in the hallway, half hidden behind a stack of architecture journals, a small wooden box. "Is that it?" I asked, nodding toward the box. "The flowers?" He hesitated, then nodded, retrieving it and setting it on the coffee table between us with a kind of careful formality, like he was presenting evidence in a trial, only he had been arguing. I opened the lid slowly. Inside were dozens of pressed flowers, flattened and faded but unmistakably preserved with care, each one nestled between thin sheets of wax paper, organized by some system I didn't immediately understand. Carnations, daisies, the single sprig of lavender from a Tuesday I barely remembered, the yellow tulip from his birthday, slightly more faded than the rest, like it had been handled more often. "You kept all of them," I whispered, "every single one." "I told you I did. I believed you. I just didn't expect." I trailed off, running my fingertip carefully along the edge of the box, overwhelmed by the sheer evidence of patience contained inside it. "This is a year of Tuesdays, Edward. A year of mornings where you had no idea if I'd ever say anything, if this would ever become anything more than flowers appearing and disappearing into a drawer. I didn't keep them because I expected anything. I kept them because throwing them away felt like throwing away proof that someone, somewhere, had thought of me without an agenda. I didn't think I deserved to lose that, even if it never went anywhere. You deserved a lot more than a box of pressed flowers and a year of silence." He settled onto the couch beside me, close enough that our knees touched. "I disagree. I think I deserved exactly the right amount of patience to become someone capable of saying something back. If you'd confronted me earlier, if I'd found out in month 2 instead of month 11, I'm not certain I would have known what to do with it. I needed the year. I needed to watch you be patient with someone who never said anything back, and slowly understand that I wanted to be the kind of person worth that patience. I leaned my head against his shoulder, and he let out a slow breath, like something in him had been holding tension for longer than either of us could measure, finally allowed to release. Tell me about the box. The order. It's not chronological, is it? No, he admitted, looking almost sheepish, an expression that sat strangely on a face usually so composed. It's ranked by how much I missed you on the days you left them. You ranked your own emotional responses to anonymous flowers. He fell back on the same defense he'd used before, the same dry deflection that I now understood covered something achingly sincere underneath. I'm an architect. Again, I organize things. It's how I cope. I laughed, and he smiled. That same rare, unguarded smile I'd only started seeing in the past few weeks. The one that still felt like a secret only I was allowed to witness. Show me. Show me which one's ranked highest. He reached into the box and carefully lifted out 3 flowers, setting them gently on the table in front of us. A white carnation. The very first one, slightly more weathered than the rest from a year of handling. A wilted daisy from a Thursday, I vaguely remembered as the day the Hendrix project had nearly collapsed under a budget dispute. And the yellow tulip from his birthday. The first one, he began, because it was the moment everything started, even though I didn't fully understand that yet. The daisy, because it was left on one of the worst days I'd had at this firm in years, and somehow you still remembered, still made the effort. Even though you had no way of knowing how badly I needed it. He paused, his fingers brushing lightly over the faded yellow tulip. And this one, because it meant you'd been paying attention long enough to know my birthday. Nobody in this office had bothered to know that in 3 years, you knew it without ever having spoken to me directly. I looked it up in the employee files, I admitted. I'm not proud of it. I told myself it was harmless curiosity. It wasn't harmless. It was the moment I started genuinely hoping. Before that, I think I'd convinced myself it was some kind of office tradition, a kindness extended to everyone, not specifically to me. The tulip told me otherwise. The tulip told me you'd gone looking for something most people never bother to find out about their coworkers, let alone someone they'd never spoken to. I sat with that for a long moment, the weight of it settling somewhere warm and tender in my chest. I think I loved you long before I understood what that meant. I think I loved you the way you love something you've decided not to let yourself want, because wanting it felt too much like setting myself up to be disappointed. You weren't disappointed. No, I agreed, turning to look at him properly, taking in the sharp lines of his face that had once felt so unreachable and now felt, impossibly, like home. I wasn't disappointed. I got exactly what I never let myself hope for. He kissed me then, slow and unhurried, his hand coming up to cradle the side of my face with a gentleness that still occasionally caught me off guard, given how composed and exacting he was in every other part of his life. Architecture had taught him precision, had taught him the unforgiving mathematics of what holds weight and what collapses under pressure. But here, with me, he seemed to have learned an entirely different kind of precision, the careful, deliberate precision of someone determined not to break something fragile and new. We spent the rest of that evening on his couch, the box of pressed flowers between us, trading stories neither of us had ever told anyone else. He told me about his mother, who had died when he was 19, and how he'd thrown himself into architecture afterward because buildings, unlike people, didn't leave without warning. I told him about my own father, who had spent most of my childhood disappointed that I hadn't followed him into law, and how filing blueprints at an architecture firm had felt in some small way like building something my own father had never bothered to understand. He'd hate this job, I admitted. He thinks anything that doesn't end in a courtroom is a waste of a good mind. And what do you think? I think I like watching things get built. I like the part where something that didn't exist yesterday exists today because someone cared enough to draft it correctly. I think that's not so different from what we did, honestly. We built this slowly, one flower at a time, without either of us having the blueprint for it. That's a generous way to describe a year of emotional avoidance. I contain multitudes, I declared, and he laughed again, that same rare and precious sound, and pulled me closer against his side, like he intended to keep me there for a very long time. Things weren't perfect after that, of course. Nothing worth having ever is. There was an uncomfortable week a few months later, when the rest of the office finally figured out what had been happening between us, sparked by an indiscreet comment from one of the junior architects who'd noticed Edward Prince smiling at his phone during a meeting. An act so uncharacteristic that the entire floor had apparently spent half a day speculating about the cause. We weathered the gossip together, mostly by ignoring it, occasionally by Edward delivering a withering look so effective that the speculation died down within a week out of pure self-preservation on everyone else's part. There was a harder week some months after that when an old fear crept back into me. The fear that I'd spent so long loving him from a careful, anonymous distance, because the distance had felt safer than the vulnerability of actually being seen, actually being known, actually risking the particular devastation of being loved back and somehow losing it anyway. I pulled away for a few days, quiet and distant in a way that worried him, though he never pushed, never demanded an explanation before I was ready to offer one. I keep waiting for this to fall apart, I admitted finally. The two of us sitting on his balcony one evening, the city spread out below us in 1,000 scattered lights. I spent so long protecting myself by never letting you know how I felt. Now that you know, now that this is real, I don't know how to stop waiting for the moment it ends. He was quiet for a long time, turning his wine glass slowly between his fingers, considering the question with the same gravity he gave everything. I can't promise you it won't end. I'm not going to insult you with a guarantee neither of us can actually make. But I can tell you that I spent a year watching you choose kindness without any evidence it would ever be returned. I think that tells me something important about the kind of person you are when things get difficult. I don't think you're someone who gives up easily. I think you're someone who shows up, even when showing up costs you something. And you? I spent a year too afraid to say anything at all. I think I understand fear better than most people give me credit for. I'm not going to pretend I'll never be afraid again. But I'd rather be afraid here, with you, building something slowly and imperfectly, than safe and alone in an apartment full of flowers I never told anyone about. I reached for his hand, and he let me hold it, his thumb tracing slow, absent circles against my knuckles, and something in my chest finally settled, some old, anxious tension I'd carried for longer than I could properly remember. The words felt strange and enormous in my mouth, the first time either of us had spoken them out loud, though we'd both clearly been circling the truth of it for months. I love you. He answered without hesitation, like he'd been waiting for the chance to say it back properly, in person, without the careful distance of a security camera or a folded photograph kept secretly in his coat pocket. I think I have for longer than I let myself admit. Somewhere around the 3rd month of flowers, if I'm being honest with the timeline. You fell in love with me over a daisy. I fell in love with the person who left the daisy, he corrected. The flower was simply the evidence. We got married 2 years later in a small ceremony neither of us had ever expected to want. Surrounded by people who'd watched the whole improbable story unfold from somewhere close enough to witness it. Co-workers who'd noticed the flowers long before. Either of us said anything friends who'd watched Edward Prince of all people become someone capable of unguarded tenderness. At the reception, someone, I never did find out who, had decorated every table with small arrangements of white carnations, and Edward laughed when he saw them, a real, surprised laugh that drew the attention of half the room. He leaned close to murmur it against my ear. They didn't know, did they? About the carnations specifically. I might have mentioned it to someone, once, in a weak moment. You're terrible at keeping secrets. I kept this one for a year, I reminded him. I think I've earned the right to be a little careless about it now. He kissed my temple, soft and unhurried, the way he'd been kissing me for 2 years now, like he still hadn't quite gotten used to the privilege of being allowed to. Around us, the reception carried on full of noise and warmth, and the particular happy chaos of people who loved us both enough to celebrate something that had started improbably, with a single anonymous flower left on a desk before sunrise. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the lights had dimmed, Edward pulled the old wooden box out from where he'd kept it, all these years somewhere safe. He set it on the table between us, the same way he had on that very first evening in his apartment, and lifted the lid to reveal the same collection of pressed faded flowers, now joined by dozens more we'd added together since that night. Flowers I'd handed him openly in person every week without fail, never anonymous again. I want to add one more. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulling out a small white carnation, fresh, clearly purchased earlier that day without my noticing. You bought a carnation for our wedding night. He set it carefully among the others, his hands moving with the same precision he brought to everything, the same patient, careful attention that had first drawn me to him long before I understood what I was feeling. I told you, I organize things. It's how I make sense of feelings I don't always have a better vocabulary for. And what does this one mean? In your ranking system? He considered the question seriously, the way he considered everything, his eyes finding mine in the soft lamplight of the room we now shared, the home we'd built slowly, deliberately, the way you build anything meant to last. This one means, I finally understand, he murmured, that the things worth building aren't always meant to be permanent in the way I used to think permanence had to look. Some things are meant to be renewed again and again by choice every single time. A flower that wilts and gets replaced isn't a failure of permanence. It's evidence of devotion that keeps showing up, on purpose, long after the mystery is gone and only the choosing remains. I closed the lid of the box gently, my hand resting over his, the two of us sitting together in the quiet of our first night as husbands surrounded by a year, now several years, of small, deliberate kindnesses that had grown slowly and improbably into an entire life. Happy anniversary. It wasn't technically an anniversary, not in any conventional sense. Of the first flower, I mean. It's been a long road to here, the longest and the best decision I never knew I was making, he said softly, until you made it impossible to keep pretending I hadn't noticed. Outside, the city hummed on the way it always did, indifferent to the small, enormous thing that had happened inside this one apartment on this one night. Two people who had spent a year circling each other in silence. Finally, home. Finally, certain. Finally, unafraid to keep showing up, one flower, one Tuesday, one quiet act of devotion at a time for as long as either of us had left to give it. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe. Comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, hit that join button right below the video. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.